Thank you to the ambassadors. This is my last chance to talk about Steve Clemons before he leaves, and I was just noticing that I was noticing his socks real quick, and I'm not sure everyone could get a clear shot at that, but Steve brings the best socks to these events. I thought this last panel was particularly interesting because of two reasons. One, the way the media portrays the U.S. trade conversation with the rest of the world is very dramatic. It's a conversation of Prime Minister Trudeau, of President Macron, of Chancellor Merkel being in a constant battle with President Trump. And what you heard from the panelists was really an entirely different take on it, that there are real substantive disputes with the U.S. on core issues, but the relationship hasn't changed that much in the macro sense. And the players, U.S. and China, are still what they've been for the last few decades, with the exception of our commentator from the UK, which just goes to show you that the closer the friend, the harder the sting hurts. The next panel is a direct connection to this one. When you think about ultimately the political impact of trade in the U.S., you're really having a conversation about how easy or hard it is for people to achieve the American dream, for people to have economic opportunity, and the impact trade has on or perceived to have on many of those communities. And then there's a broader question of whether the American dream is still alive or whether it's dead. And we have three really remarkable speakers who are, I think, the national experts in economic mobility to talk about this. Scott Winship, the project director for social capital and social mobility for the Office of the Vice Chairman of the Congressional Joint Economic Committee. Dr. Richard Reeves, Senior Fellow for Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution, who famous for a book he wrote called Dream Hoarders, and named one of the top 50 thinkers on class and inequality in the U.S. And then Dr. Caroline Ratcliffe, Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute, co-director for Opportunity and Ownership Initiative, published all over the country, all over the world, around her work on asset building and those questions around poverty. And moderated by my longtime friend and conspirator, John Lettieri, the president and co-founder of the Economic Innovation Group. Big round of applause for our next panel.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. We're in the valley of death right after lunch, mid-afternoon. Everybody's feeling sleepy, so this is going to be a lively panel to keep you all awake and engaged, and I'm really excited about having to share the stage with these three experts, I think three of the very best on this issue. So we're here to talk about upward mobility and the American dream. And if you follow the debate on the American dream and mobility at all, you know that there's been quite a shift where for decades we kind of took for granted that America was the land of opportunity and that anyone from anywhere could rise and make it. And today there seems to be much more of a schizophrenic view that maybe we're not doing so well, maybe the American dream is dying or dead, or maybe that other countries have overtaken us in terms of providing opportunity and upward mobility. So we're going to unpack some of that. We're going to bust some myths, I hope. We're going to propose some bold ideas and discuss them. But first, we really have to get to the elephant in the room, which is Richard.
Thank you.
As we speak right now, there's a certain sporting event about to kick off. And poor Richard Reeves, the last time that England made it this far, he was in college. And he didn't back out. So we've got a TV set up in the green room. Nobody tell Richard the score. You know, when we do Q&A, don't break it for poor Richard. But we have to acknowledge this was a massive feat for Richard. So in reward, we're going to let you have the first word. Set the table for us about this debate. What is the state of the American dream and upward mobility today? Is it dying?
So, well, thank you for the introduction, and you've spared me having to come out as a recovering Brit. And traditionally, at an event like this, you would congratulate the organizers for the panel and the timing and so on. But I'm going to loudly curse you for the timing of the panel. To be fair, I could have planned ahead, but as you said, the last time England made it to the semi-final, I was in college. And the last time England made it to the final, I hadn't been born. So the stakes are pretty high, and in fact, we can probably test exactly how important this is by using James Crabtree as a litmus test. So James Crabtree was on the previous panel, Actually, I gave him, I think, one of his first jobs out of college. I've known James for a very long time. It's a very small country, you see. We all know each other. So James, I'm sure, is not in the room right now. James, are you in the room? You see, he's not even here. He's not even listening. He's next door, I'm sure.
He's in the green room.
So, but I do bring that sort of, I'm American now, US citizen now, but I bring that sort of comparative perspective to bear. And here's what I'll say. First of all, we have to do a little bit of distinguishing by what do we mean by upward mobility? How would we know if we had the American dream or not? That's where metrics really matter and where people get confused about different measures of mobility. So if you measure mobility in what we'd call relative terms, do you move up and down the ladder relative to where your parents were? It looks like that's been pretty flat for a few decades now. And that the US probably isn't as different to other countries either negatively or positively as both sides of the partisan divide would suggest. I think there's a bit more separation at the top. So I think that those who are at the top of the income distribution, the upper middle class, the top 20% are getting a bit better at passing on that status to their children. But other than that, I think the real story here is one of race and place. And so the big story is that black Americans in particular have very low rates of relative mobility. So if you're born black and at the bottom into poverty, you're twice as likely to stay there as an adult as if you're white. More strikingly, in some ways, if you're born into the middle of the distribution and you're black, you're twice as likely to fall compared to whites. And so there's a really kind of very important story about black mobility, but also place. We see huge variation between different places, which we can't always explain. But we know from the work of Ratcliffe at the Equality of Opportunity Project, who I work for a little bit, that different places have very, very different outcomes. So you can't really generalize sensibly about the US more generally. But the other kind of mobility is, am I doing better than my parents did? Have I surpassed where mum and dad were? Which is what we call absolute mobility. And there's been a decline. But there's been a decline because when the economy is growing at 4% a year for nearly 25 years and your parents were in the Depression, chances are you're going to be better off than them, as the post-war generation were. For the generation born in 1980, much harder to overtake their parents. And so it rather depends who you're comparing yourself to. If you're comparing yourself to how your parents were doing at the equivalent age, then right now you're going to be disappointed. But that's as much a reflection of economic history. And I think we need to come to terms with the fact that the post-war 25 years in the US were the exception. And we need to stop treating it as if it was the rule.
Caroline, you think a lot about economic instability and how that factors into this conversation. Why don't you set the scene for us?
Yeah, so you're talking about income. So what I want to do is add to this conversation a little bit about wealth, and wealth can help protect families from instability. But so income is what you earn. So for most people, it's their earnings. Wealth is what you own minus what you owe. So it's your savings, retirement, your home equity. And what I would argue is that wealth is linked directly to mobility, that it provides the opportunity to purchase a home in a good neighborhood with good schools. You can send your children to college, start a business. So you've got this linkage. And to your 2 points about age and also race. So if we're sort of thinking about wealth as being important for mobility, what does it look like? How has wealth changed over time by age and by race? So first, if we look today at people in the baby boom and the silent generation, that those people, so today they're in their 50s, 60s, 70s, if we compare their wealth today to people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s back in the early 1980s, so 30 to 35 years ago, what we see is that for those older groups, their wealth has more than doubled. But now if we look at the younger generation, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, their wealth has really stagnated. Their wealth is just a little bit higher than people at the same age. So we do see that this wealth that's been accumulated aggregately in the US has really gone to older generations. And then the race piece, I couldn't agree with you more on that. What we've seen over time is a widening of racial wealth gaps. We have very large racial wealth gaps. We had wide racial wealth gaps 30, 50 years ago, and those have just gotten wider over time. So as we're thinking about, let me just make one other point, and as we're thinking about intergenerational transfers from this older generation to the younger generation, that could really just make the racial wealth gap even larger and have additional implications for mobility of families of color.
Scott, you're leading one of the most interesting projects, I think, right now on Capitol Hill, and I'm going to let you do your disclaimer in a second that I know you want to do. But leading the Social Capital Project of the Joint Economic Committee, How does social capital factor into it? How do you define it? How do you quantify that? And then kind of weave these two things together, the idea of social capital in places with strong social capital, the idea of upward mobility.
Well, thanks, John, for the opportunity to give everybody my disclaimer. So nothing that I'm going to say should reflect any views of the Joint Economic Committee, which the Social Capital Project is embedded in, or Senator Mike Lee's office. But the project is really remarkable, and Senator Lee gets all the credit for it. It's essentially an academic research project within a congressional committee, and it's been a real privilege to head it. So what's social capital? Very quickly, I think the idea social capital is a form of wealth, essentially. It's not financial wealth, but it's the assets that are constituted by and embedded in our social relationships from which we get value, just like we get value from any asset. It requires investment, just like any asset, can be depleted. And so the project is really about what's the state of social capital in America. Social capital is not important solely for economic mobility, obviously, but the claim is that people who are embedded in families and communities that are mobility promoting have a real advantage over people who are embedded in families and communities that are mobility impeding. So that's a claim. Fortunately, there is some evidence to back that claim up. Most of it comes from Raj Chetty, whose name will probably be invoked a dozen times before the panel's over, because he's done such amazing work on mobility over the last few years. Raj and his team have a social capital index that they borrowed from Penn State University. Our project has built a new one that we think is better. But even the old one, Raj showed that there were very strong correlations between an area's social capital and its mobility outcomes. Similarly, he's also shown that single parenthood appears to be strongly correlated with social capital across places. He had this provocative finding in the first paper that even kids who grew up with two parents do worse if their area has a lot of single parents. You can interpret that two ways. One, that single parent is really bad for everybody, or that, well, maybe it's not the single parenthood that's the disadvantage. Maybe it's these other things that are also affecting the kids with married parents. He's made some progress on this question. Most recently, he had a fascinating paper on black-white mobility differences, and he has this great finding where essentially African-American boys do better in places where there are more when there are more black fathers present. So more white fathers present doesn't impact them, and for white kids, more black fathers present doesn't improve their outcomes. It's more white fathers presence does. And so this, I think, is starting to get to be more compelling evidence that single parenthood and concentrated single parenthood really can make a big difference. We've correlated our social capital index with things like the Economic Innovation Group's Distressed Communities Index. John wanted me to punch up the panel, so I'll cite correlations. 0.76, which is pretty high correlation across counties. It correlates about 0.76 with Opportunity Nation's Opportunity Index. It correlates about 0.45 with Raj Chetty's relative mobility stuff. So increasingly, it looks like social capital is very important. I'd reinforce the point about race that Carolyn and Richard made. You can look at our maps of social capital and very clearly see the legacy of, for instance, slavery on a county-by-county basis, I should say. It's just very clear that a lot of the social capital deficits and mobility problems that we have are really, really deep-seated and have thorny historical causes that merit our attention.
So I want to turn back to you, Dr. Ratcliffe. And so if I'm synthesizing what the three of you have said, place, race, social capital, these are three very important things in terms of the factors that play in. Not all of them, maybe not any of them, lend themselves well to policymaking, or the policymaking solutions are challenging to come by. And that's what we've seen historically. So what is the role of policy, whether at the federal level, the local level? I know you've looked at some specific local examples where there has been success in removing barriers and promoting upward mobility. So talk first about the role you think of policymaking in helping to address this challenge, and what are the specific examples that have worked?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think that there is a role for policy here, and here is a place where the federal government is playing a big role in wealth building, except the vast majority of that money is going to high-income families. So roughly $400 billion is spent every year in subsidizing and supporting wealth building. About 2/3 of that goes to the top 80% of income families. So those are the people who need it least and are seeing, I didn't mention wealth inequality, but we're seeing large increases in wealth inequality. So that we really need to be looking at those policies and thinking about ways to change that and provide greater sharing across people of lower and middle income. There are policies, so that's sort of federal. There are things that are happening at the state and local level, particularly if we think about children and what children need for mobility. There's children's savings accounts. Sometimes they're talked about as baby bonds, but these are accounts that are targeted towards all children who are born or when they start kindergarten, and that they're to be used, so they're building wealth over time, and then they're to be used when they turn age 18 to go to college or to buy a home for a business. And so here there's, states are doing it, localities are doing it. San Francisco was a real leader here with their kindergarten to college, and that's exactly what it is. It's a goal to get all the kindergartners to college or at least have a savings cushion. So there's a number, and that is really, we're trying to, there's efforts to push that up and have that be more at the federal level.
Richard, you've written a lot about how public policy skews towards what you call the dream hoarding of the upper middle class and above, and I think to Caroline's point, helps with the subsidization of wealth accumulation and economic advantages at the top. So to you, is it more an issue of what we should stop doing, or are there things proactively that we should be more focused on at whatever level of government to help upward mobility?
Well, I think we can do both. I strongly endorse Caroline's point about what you call the upside-down tax subsidies in the US tax code. Having moved here from the UK, two observations were, wow, there's a lot of ways in which I can reduce my tax bill by like buying an expensive house or sending my kids to summer school or whatever. You know, my accountant was amazed. I didn't know there were all these ways that I could basically avoid massive amounts of tax. And secondly, the American upper middle class really know how to look after themselves when it comes to protecting those subsidies and it comes to protecting their advantages. And the reason that matters is not just from a kind of, not so much from a kind of politics of envy leveling point of view, but because that releases the resources that we might need to do other things. So if we do sort of think there are investments we can make, for example, in vocational training, high quality vocational training from 16 to 20, or help some of our community colleges that are really struggling. You know, the modal institution for middle class American kids is either a community college or a pretty open access 4-year college, but you wouldn't think that from the debate about post-secondary education in Congress, and we need more money for that. Where do we get it from? Well, you can get it from us. You can get it from the upper middle class. But I actually think to address your question more directly, some of the things that affect mobility, like family instability, for example, and I'd probably, Scott and I will disagree about whether it's structure or stability maybe, but are quite hard to get at directly through public policy. You might get at it through encouraging more stable work or through having more assets and so on. But I do think that to the extent that some of these things are place-based and they are quite locally based, there is quite a bit we can do. So to take Scott's point about social capital, or what I like to think of as relational inequality, this idea of what are the relationships that people have across class and race lines, those are still quite geographical in their context. So we know quite well that people know people that live near them. That gives them opportunities, and as Scott said, there's this quite good evidence that the nature of the social capital in a place affects outcomes for kids in those places. So how do we mix our communities? How do we make sure our communities don't, as your work shows, separate out? So whilst racial segregation has dropped slightly in the US, economic segregation by neighborhood seems to have increased in the US. And so to put it very bluntly, my neighbor, living in an upper middle class neighborhood as I do, is somewhat more likely to be black than they were 30 years ago, but they're quite a lot less likely to be working class. Okay? So what we're seeing is more class stratification. Why? Because of the housing market, because of land use regulation, because of the tax use subsidies, because of the NIMBYism, sometimes dressed up as environmentalism, which we use to rig the housing market in our favor. What level of government does that change at? Either local or state. And so it seems to me that it's a really clear policy that we could engage in, which is to unrig the American housing market such that land gets cheaper in the places where the jobs are, and we stop hoarding the wealth and opportunities by zip code, which we currently use policy to do.
Scott, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on the question of whether we should be more worried about individual wealth inequality and income inequality or place inequality, the kind of geographical distribution of opportunity and economic growth. Which of the two, if we had to choose one, and why?
So I've always thought that we ought to be primarily concerned about inequality of opportunity, and I think that is pretty widely shared even between people on the left and right. I think the big difference between left and right is the extent to which you believe that income inequality reduces or increases inequality of opportunity. And there, I don't think the evidence is that strong. It's a very tough question to actually answer rigorously and convincingly. But I don't see the evidence that as inequality grows, opportunity declines. Maybe sort of the easiest factoid for me to bust out up here is just that we all know income inequality has soared, especially at the top, income concentration among the top 1% since the late 1970s. The best evidence, we don't have conclusive evidence yet, but I would say the most studies tend to find that economic mobility hasn't really declined. It hasn't increased, but it hasn't declined really in about 50 or 60 years. And that's also supported by Raj Chetty's research, but he sort of ratified this finding that 10 or 12 other studies had previously found. So I worry most about inequality of opportunity, and I think focusing on inequality feels like a way to get at inequality of opportunity, but I don't see the evidence as a causal connection, and I think the downsides of sort of redistributing too much are potentially large.
Can I try and
Please.
just I think that getting hung up on whether there's a causal relationship between inequality and mobility misses the point. It's hard to prove one way or the other, and I don't care. I do think, so let me just, do you agree that the US has higher rates of income inequality than most other equivalently economically advanced countries?
Yep,
right?
for sure.
Would you agree that the US doesn't have demonstrably or provably higher rates of intergenerational mobility than other countries?
So definitely doesn't have higher.
Definitely doesn't have higher, okay.
But
doesn't necessarily have lower.
I've got a paper coming out that will show that for earnings mobility in particular, it doesn't look like we actually have lower.
Okay, but I don't need that to make my point, which is simply that which is just it's not higher. Sure. In terms of the political economy of a country and social contract, this relates a bit to the previous session. Actually, you can imagine a country where there's not that much mobility, so the rich and poor don't change places very much, but there's not that much inequality either. So in other words, we compensate the people at the bottom quite handsomely, and we take a lot of money off the winners. So the losers get more, the winners get less. You might imagine that that's okay as a country to live in. You might imagine another country where there's quite high levels of inequality, but a lot of movement between rich and poor, so it's not determining it. What I think is really not sustainable is a country with pretty high levels of income inequality and relatively modest levels of economic mobility. I just think politically, forget about the empirics for a moment, and whether that's, if you basically agree with those facts, I think that let's not get hung up on whether A causes B. Let's just say, given A and B, are we content with the current rate of mobility? And I think where we'd agree is, all of us would agree is, no, we're not. We want higher rates of intergenerational mobility than we currently have.
Absolutely, but I do think the question of whether you also need to reduce inequality is a lot more complicated. If we had a world where CEOs made a lot more than janitors did, especially compared to other countries, but the son of a janitor had the same chance to be a CEO as the son of a CEO, I think we'd find that world much less objectionable than a world where, for instance, the income differences between CEOs and janitors has been diminished, but the son of a janitor can never hope to be the son of a CEO.
I think if you had, if it really was all equal, then we would have policies that were, the CEO today would be more worried about the policies about what's going to happen if his son becomes a janitor. Since I was in the middle here,
yes.
Maybe I can I just make a point, because you brought up instability a couple of times and you mentioned it. So if I can just, instability, I really see instability as a key piece and a key, or that it really can eat away at mobility. And as we think about policies, we really should be thinking about the extent to which families experience instability from year to year, but it can really be month to month, week to week, day to day. And the extent to which, so Pew did a study where they found that 60% of American families will either experience a large drop in income in a year or an expense spike. And so this is really on the minds of families. So we're not just talking about low-income families, we're also talking about middle-income families, what they're experiencing and their opportunities for mobility. And Pew also, in part of their survey, they asked people, do you prefer stability or mobility? So what percent of people do you think said they prefer stability? Turns out it's the vast majority, it's 92% of people said that they prefer stability over mobility. And I think partly embedded into that answer is that for lots of people, stability is mobility. If I can just have stability for me and my family, I'm better off. And so I think that this issue about stability, what wealth can bring to it, is key as we're thinking about policies to move mobility.
Yeah. I think what happens is that the left tend to focus on economic instability, and the right tend to focus on family instability or social instability, and of course they're both right. I think there's issues like wealth, there's issues like scheduling. I think for a lot of people just not knowing what their schedule is going to be further out, I think that's quite an interesting sort of trend, just to kind of know what your income is going to be. But I do think this kind of point about family stability matters. So I'll do a little test here. Hands up who's bought J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy. Hands up who bought his book. Yeah, that's why it's been on the bestseller list for a year.
I thought you said who was bored by his book.
Sorry, no, who bought. No, it's a great book. It's a great book, and I would like everyone who's bought his book to also buy my book.
It's quite shameless.
But what's
Honestly.
well, you know,
I mean,
I'm here.
take your opportunity.
I'm here. You made me sit through the England game.
It's fair. It's fair.
But what's interesting about that is he does get family stability at the end, but he gets it from his grandmother. His mother keeps marrying and divorcing and moving and having all kinds of problems and so on and drugs. But he finds it through his grandmother. Actually, his mother's marriages were a nightmare. She kept marrying, alcoholic or abusive, and finally he spends like 3 or 4 years with his grandmother. And so what that speaks to me about is that yes, stability matters, and she had a reasonably steady income because she was on Social Security, and that just gave them the stability that you talk about. The slight fear I have, and I say this as a new American, when I hear those poll findings about people focusing on stability rather than mobility, is that's not very American. And my slight fear is that particularly post-recession, and with the fears that people have got, is they're starting to put more and more emphasis on stability and security rather than on bettering themselves, rather than on improving, rather than moving to a better job, taking a risk on a new business, investing in their own education and so on. And that's a bit dangerous because that feels a bit European to me. That's actually the kind of trading. And I'm not saying that they're both important, but I slightly worry that actually at some point you end up, the worst of all worlds is an America with a European mindset, but an American welfare system.
Well, it raises the question, do you think we've become a less aspirational country? And that's, again, something that's hard to quantify, but I'd love your reaction to that.
I think that's an important question. I think it sort of relates in some ways to this issue of absolute mobility. So when I said mobility hasn't fallen over 50, 60 years, that was relative mobility. Richard's absolutely right that absolute mobility has fallen quite a bit. And I think what we have to keep in mind and in the context that we need is, as Richard said, it's a lot harder to exceed how your parents did as countries become richer. We could, so thought experiment, would you rather have the absolute mobility, the chance of beating your parents that someone born in 1940 had, or the living standards that somebody born in 1940 had growing up? I'm sorry, to have that level of absolute mobility and those living standards versus today's lower absolute mobility, but our much higher living standards than someone born in 1940. It turns out that among among kids who grow up with poor parents, almost all of them exceed their parents' income. It's well in the 90% range. That's less true for richer kids. Now, would you rather be a richer kid or have your kids be richer, but have a smaller chance of exceeding you? Or would you rather have your kids be poor or be poor yourself, but have a bigger chance of exceeding your kids' incomes? So I think a lot of what's changed is we've just gotten richer over time, and so we end up focusing more on, I think, these issues of stability and of sort of time crunches and the things that two-worker families are now having to deal with more and more, which we didn't have as many two-worker families as we did in the 60s.
I want to kind of follow on the theme of instability through the lens of criminal justice and talk about how that plays a role. We talked about place and race. We know that the criminal justice system applies differently to certain people in certain places, and in many ways is an extractive industry for low-income people and communities. So whether we think about bail reform or asset forfeiture or the fines and penalties that are often the result of being economically unstable, and how those perpetuate and snowball, and how that can disrupt the fragile economic stability in a family's life. How much does that play in? Because obviously that has changed. The way that the criminal justice system applies in this country has changed over the decades. And when we think about, we mentioned earlier, this real crisis of mobility among African Americans and the overlay of that with criminal justice, how does that play out? And what should we be thinking about in that context?
I've been thinking about this a lot. With the Ferguson issue, it's really come out that the way in which localities are funding government, and they're funding government with fees and fines, and that these fees and fines can really harm stability and mobility. And when we're thinking about what's the role of government, the role of government should not be increasing increasing instability and harming mobility. And in my view, that's exactly what these fees and fines are doing. I think and then there are places where if you can't pay your fee or fine, then your license is taken away. And now you've just put people in the situation where they can't get their job, and they might actually really become involved with the justice system because they're driving without a license. There are places that are really starting to think about this. San Francisco is a real leader here again, that they have a criminal justice project going on. What they saw was that it was really lose-lose. They weren't getting resources in because they were giving all these fees to people. They couldn't pay them. It was harming their well-being for the people, and they weren't getting the resources in. So they're really thinking about how they levy fees. Should they be income-based in some way? So I just think at the local level, we should really be looking at these policies, and the government should not be making people worse off. My strong conviction.
So I think on the one hand, you see this clustering of severe disadvantage that is particularly true of Black Americans, and their interaction with police and criminal justice is part of that clustering. On the other hand, it looks as if those disadvantages are so very great to begin with that actually incarceration and the result of interaction with the criminal justice system doesn't have as strongly predictive effect as you would imagine, given all the disadvantages that came before it. And Adam Looney, a colleague of mine at Brookings, has used some Chetty data to show that. That's really quite a disturbing finding, I think. So in other words, I think we have to see it as part of a cluster. On the other hand, the US just clearly imprisons way too many people for way too many small crimes. And we should comb through public policy just to see what some of the unfortunate legacies of the war on drugs were. You know, people on the right are very fond of saying we had a war on poverty and poverty won. Well, we had a war on drugs, and I'm not sure the drugs didn't win. But you get these, from that era, which was bipartisan, clearly, of the war on drugs, you get policies such as you don't qualify for financial aid for college if you have a drug-related crime on your record. That strikes me as wrong morally, to just take a crime in this space and apply it to your access to a good in this space, and incredibly short-sighted from the point of view of upward mobility and closing race gaps. And it's just there as a legacy of the war on drugs, and I don't think any legislator is going to be brave enough to touch it, and so it just sits there in our legal code doing some damage, who knows how much. It's just an absurd reaction to the war on drugs. So there'll be things like that, which I don't overstate how important they are, which I think will have some effect, but really we need to get at kind of what lies behind those clustered disadvantages.
So the time we have left, I want to transition to solutions and the framework for certain solutions. So one, I want to end on what's the bold idea? If you were king for a day or queen for a day, what would be the thing that you would really try as an experiment at whatever scale that you think we're not likely to do, so this is your kind of moonshot opportunity. But I want to start with having you answer what should be the goal? Because given where we are now, we've kind of established that mobility in a relative sense has stayed pretty flat, pretty stable. There's not a lot of evidence they're doing much worse than analogous economies. There's a lot to like. There's some things really not to like and that are the low-hanging fruit. So what should be our goal from a policy or from a civic perspective? Start with that, and then in service of either that goal or a broader goal, what would be the moonshot idea that you'd like to see tried if you had the control? Scott.
Well, so I think the overarching goal, the real mobility problem that we have in the United States, sort of end where we began in some ways, is just the giant racial inequality in opportunity. I think things are not getting worse in the United States. We are worse than some countries on some measures, but the real glaring injustice, I think, is that black-white gap. If I wave my wand and offer two policy proposals, one liberals will like, one conservatives will like. So the liberal one, I've proposed it before. Richard actually proposed it before me to have an Office of Opportunity in the White House to really make this a national goal of increasing upward mobility in the United States. And just my version of it would massively fund local experiments to promote school readiness. I think sort of all the action has got to be towards kids before they get to school. There are just vast test score gaps, even among kindergartners.
But so Scott, is the thought there that we have the capacity to get back to historic levels of absolute mobility, or is there some other metric that
So I'd probably have different policy proposals for absolute mobility. I think then it's around increasing economic growth through a lot of the things that EIG is talking about, trying to figure out how to get innovation higher and entrepreneurship, getting rid of a lot of things like occupational licensing and zoning, things like that. But I think for relative mobility, the solutions are just completely different. And so I fund an Office of Opportunity and subsidize a ton of rigorously evaluated programs that will immediately get shuttered if they don't show results. Pro-conservative policy would be something I've proposed also that no one has touched, left or right, but I think it would make a difference. I think we need to figure out how to promote marriage more. I say this as a single parent myself, so I don't have ill will towards single parents. Marriage promotion programs have not worked. The George W. Bush administration tried, and they were rigorously evaluated and were shown not really to have done that much. I think we need to take a page from the policy around promoting work, and instead of sort of trying to give people soft skills or whatever, what we really need to do is give people like very obvious, large and attractive incentives to change their behavior. And so I've proposed taking the child tax credit and not cutting it for single parents, but expanding it a lot for married parents to provide a big signal. It's not going to affect any family where the one or both have chosen not to live together. I can certainly, from experience, say that. But it could cause more people to sort of have in the back of their head, maybe I need to be a little bit more careful about getting pregnant, for instance, because if I wait until I'm in a better situation with a better partner, I've got this giant reward coming to me in the future. I think it's worth trying.
Dr. Ratcliffe.
So I struggle with this sort of big idea because I'm pulled between focusing on children and their prospects and also sort of the stability piece. But I would say that even though it's being experimented with at the local level, it really around these baby bonds, getting children, getting them on a path towards wealth building so that when they get to their late teen years, there's resources in there. But I'd like to think about it as a structure where we're also incentivizing or providing incentives for families and low-income families to have emergency savings. I think you can't just focus only on the kids. We need to be thinking, or new kids, we need to be thinking about families that are struggling today. So I think some sort of combination there I would put in.
Richard?
For the goal, I think I'd mix a relative and an absolute in the following way. I think I'd want to set some really strong targets for the outcomes for kids born into the bottom 20%, which is roughly consistent with the federal poverty line, who get a secure foothold into the middle class. And then I'd probably define the middle class in an absolute way, which we could talk about. But I do think this point about getting to an absolute level and getting there securely is hugely important. And then how would you go about that? Well, you've encouraged us to be bold or even utopian. So I'll take that at face value. I'm struck thinking about the fact we had the Singapore ambassador on the stage before us. Singapore has a policy whereby every single apartment building, let alone every neighborhood, has to exactly reflect the racial composition of the Singapore population. That's quite strong social engineering, to be sure, but I wonder if we couldn't start to say, well, look, within a particular locality, you should look a little bit like the metro. If not, we'll use some policy levers against you. That's a very, very utopian idea, but I am so deeply worried about the geographical separation of Americans by class that I think something bold in that direction is required. I think that the wealth problem is a big one and the race gap is a big problem, and some people have made compelling arguments for reparations. I think I would argue for something like city sovereign wealth funds, which you could fund from higher levels of inheritance and estate taxes and so on, which you could first of all offer to or provide for predominantly black cities perhaps, so it would have some sort of race-conscious effect. But what about, in the same way that some countries have a sovereign wealth fund, what if a city had a sovereign wealth fund that it could use to invest in opportunity? And then thirdly, and probably most wildly of all, lower the high school leaving age to 16 and amply fund 3 or 4 years of high-quality vocational education for everybody who chose to take that route, because it strikes me that for a lot of American kids, the last 2 years of high school are really, really not delivering value. So let's go the other way, lower it, but complement that with massive investment in high-quality vocational education. The stigma attached to vocational education in the US is a massive problem now, and we need to address it.
Look at that.
It's wild, but it's popular.
Look at that.
Or did England just score?
One point to that, one of my colleagues is doing a lot of work on apprenticeship, and that fits right in with your point about vocational education, but just that we in the US, we're not doing well by these kids who are not getting a 4-year degree. You know, kids are going, they're starting college, some of them are taking on debt, they're not completing college, but some sort of vocational education along with apprenticeship, I think could go a long way to helping improve the well-being of children.
But the way it's divided by class, whenever we talk about it, it's always, we're always talking about this for other people's kids, or almost always, right? We still put our own kids on the 4-year selective college track. Why? Because we know we've seen the data on wage premiums and everything else, and so there is this real problem around it.
There is, but Europe, I mean, I think Europe does much better in the apprenticeship area, and I think that there's a lot of lessons to bring here.
Yeah, part of the issue is, I think, the justifiable fear here of tracking. And I think that obviously is a legitimate fear, but what that's done is it's meant underinvestment in some of those vocational alternatives.
Outstanding. Well, this has been an excellent discussion. Please join me in giving a round of applause for our panelists. Thanks very much.